Hello everyone and welcome back to JAS Reviews. My name is James and welcome to my first episode of the Critical Corner for the year 2022. I know it's been a while since I've done one of these as I've been doing a lot of lists and just the way my work schedule has gone, I haven't really had time to make official reviews in quite some time. But now I feel like I'm on a more consistent schedule, and hopefully reviews will be more consistent from now on. As always with my episodes of the Critical Corner, I either talk about all music or all movies in shorter form. I do have a new rule that I have incorporated on my Critical Corner episodes, and that rule is that I only talk about at most 4 albums or 4 pieces of media or film at a time. I don't go beyond that because I don't just want to overdo it. Yeah, we are going to be talking about 4 different albums for this episode. Let's just go ahead and get started with what has already been a pretty big year for music. And here we go.
Bit of more than you can chew, can you taste it? Oh, you should've known better to fuck with someone like me.
With the revival of pop punk, especially in the mainstream scene, it's not surprising that an artist like Avril Lavigne decided to come back in a big way this year. And I was very excited to see what she would be doing with this new pop punk revival. Her last album, Head Above Water, was very disappointing, I felt like. I know a lot of people didn't care for it much, and you can count me amongst that group. I thought the album was very underwhelming, save for the title track and a couple of other songs. So it made sense with this revival that she would jump back on that, and I personally think that she does pop punk better than a lot of people out there, and Love Sucks sorta does prove that in places. Now, this album isn't perfect and there are some problems with it, which I will get to, but the most primary thing to compliment this album for is that it is a lot of fun. It just brings pop punk to a level where it's accessible for audiences of pretty much any age, and it doesn't really need to do much else than that. It doesn't have to have over-the-top lyrics. It just is simple and to the point, and sometimes that's okay for an album to do. I think the first 3 tracks really get this album on a very strong start. Cannonball is a type of song that sounds straight out of Avril's early career and something that people are really going to like. I really think the guitar riff in it is very punchy, and Avril's voice is as good as ever. It really sounds like she still has the voice from her first 2 albums, which is really impressive when you think about it. The second track, Boys Lie, is the first of 3 features on this album, and this one has Machine Gun Kelly. Now, Machine Gun Kelly is an artist that I've really not enjoyed lately because of all his stuff that he's said and about how he's the savior of pop punk and everything. He's very full of himself, I think. But at the same time, I did enjoy his album Tickets to My Downfall, and I enjoy his feature here on Boys Lie. I think he does a good job pairing up with Avril, and they're a match that actually fits very well together. It's talking about a relationship where both parties lie, and I think it's good enough in that aspect. But then the third track comes, which also happens to be my favorite on the album, and it is also the lead single, Bite Me. When I first heard this song, I was having so much fun with it. It is a nostalgia trip through and through, I will admit that, and I have, like most people, a love for songs that bring nostalgia to me and make me feel like that time when I was younger. And this song does that, and I think it is so much fun in that way, and Avril's voice, appropriately, has a lot of bite behind it. Sure, the lyrics, "You're gonna wish I was your wifey," are a little silly, but then again, the song isn't really trying to take itself too seriously. And, of course, Travis Barker, who is doing the drumming across this whole album, and Avril is a part of his record label now, is an added bonus. I will also say that for as basic as a song like Avalanche is, I do think it is a sincere enough song, and I think it is vulnerable enough that it works. Yeah, the lyrics are a little basic and just very straight and to the point, but that's what Avril has done for quite some time. She has always been that way, I feel like. And then we have a song like All I Wanted, which features Mark Hoppus of Blink-182, which is another huge highlight on here. And I think their 2 voices mesh really well together. And it's really cool to see 2 veterans of the pop punk scene coming together to create a very iconic song. And of course, you can tell that Mark Hoppus is lockstep in with Travis Barker. It just works very well in that regard. And I think the ending track, even though it is only less than 2 minutes, still ends the album off on a very punchy and memorable note. So yeah, this album all in all is very fun in that regard. Now, I will say that this album does definitely have some flaws with it. The biggest flaw is the lyrics for sure. Now, did I necessarily expect this album to be thought-provoking? No, and I think Bite Me set the tone as the lead single that it wasn't going to be that. But at the same time, some of these lyrics are a little bit childish and a little bit too silly for me, like the title track, for an example. Also, Love It When You Hate Me is probably the weakest song on here with Black Bear as a feature, and I just think his void of personality is all too prevalent on this song. And then you've also got other cheesy songs such as Kiss Me Like the World Is Ending, which is as over-the-top ridiculous as its title sounds, and I think Deja Vu and FU are also both a little childish, even though FU does have a really good riff to it that almost makes up for it. But, I mean, at the end of the day, this album is exactly what it wants to be. It's a fun pop-punk romp with great vocal work from Avril Lavigne, and I think some decent enough instrumentation. I don't think it's as strong lyrically as her earlier albums, and I think her earlier albums, believe it or not, even though she was much, much younger then, have more thought-provoking content in them. But at the same time, it does feel like the Avril that we've all wanted for quite some time, and it feels like she's back. So for that reason, I did really enjoy this album, and I had a lot of fun with it. I can't give it anything higher than a 3 out of 5 stars for the fact that its lyrics are a little basic to me for my taste, and the album does start getting very samey sounding, especially in its second half. But for its strong start and its strong ending, I can give it a solid recommendation. So yeah, check this album out if you haven't yet.
When the curtains call the time, will we both go home alive? It wasn't hard to realize.
Next up is an album I've been very excited about and have really been looking forward to talking about, and that is Bad Omens' third album, The Death of Peace of Mind. Now, Bad Omens is an artist that I have not really ever been extremely understanding of why they have hype compared to other bands of their kind. To me, they just sound like Bring Me the Horizon clones in many ways, and that's what's most frustrating about them, because I've always been able to tell that they have talent, but they always have merged that talent with trying to sound like many different versions of Bring Me the Horizon. I do think their second album, Finding God Before God Finds Me, was an improvement over the first album. In fact, I did enjoy that second album. But once again, whereas the first album sounded too much like Sempiternal, this one sounded like it was trying to take too many influences from That's the Spirit. And there were many places where you could hear that influence bleeding through. But then there were songs like Careful What You Wish For and Kingdom of Cards that showed that the band was starting to have their own identity. So when I was hearing the lead singles for this third album, I was really excited because it sounded like the band was really starting to have their own sort of sound, their own sort of thing that they were going for. The title track that led off this album's release was really interesting to me and sounded like a really intriguing new soundscape for them. And when I heard their other song, their other lead single, Artificial Suicide, I got even more excited for what this album was going to hold. So what did we get out of Bad Omens' third album? Well, if we're still comparing their trajectory to Bring Me the Horizons, then this album would be their Amo. It's definitely much more poppy than their first two albums, and it goes for that sound a lot more. There's not as much screaming on this album as I'm sure some fans were hoping for. But honestly, for me, this album is excellent. I think it's a good thing that the band ditched the screaming aspects almost entirely and went for a much more just straightforward metal, hardcore, post-hardcore sound that really works for them to great advantage, while incorporating some pop tendencies that work very well for the band. The lead vocalist here is the best he has ever sounded, in my opinion. He is great throughout this whole album. And I also think this album does a really good job at laying out its conceptual arc of this relationship that continues to deteriorate more and more over the course of the album. And I like how the opening song, Concrete Jungle, establishes this idea of the idea that this relationship that the lead singer thought was going to work out flew too close to the sun, and he created a sort of disaster of his own making, essentially, also musically. This album has the best hooks that Bad Omen has ever penned. Songs such as Nowhere to Go and what is my personal favorite on the album, Just Pretend, show this in great detail with some hooks that just bury their claws into right away. Just Pretend in particular is a very haunting anthem about this idea that this couple that has been outlined in this whole concept album is at this point just pretending that their relationship is okay because that's all that they can do to cope, essentially. It's a very tragic song in that regard, and I think the lead singer's voice really accentuates that tragedy, along with the beautiful incorporation of electronics combined with guitar work. The title track itself is still a song that stands out to me in huge ways. I think it just has such an overwhelmingly excellent atmosphere to it, and it feels like it has a real menace to it. I like the vocoded vocals as well. I think they do a good job of creating that atmosphere. And I appreciate that the vocoded vocals are used more often in this album as well. I think they do a good job of using them when they're appropriate and not making them too much of a gimmick. In fact, it almost becomes an identity of this album in many ways, and I think that's only a good thing. Like a Villain is another example of a song with overwhelming atmosphere, and it feels appropriately villainous, like the title would suggest. I really like the previous song that builds up to that as well and incorporates some really cool orchestration. And if you were missing the classic Bad Omens, it's not like they abandoned that entirely here. You still have songs like The Grey and Artificial Suicide that bring the classic Bad Omens flair to the forefront. Artificial Suicide in particular is one that I am sure is going to be a fan favorite, as it is the only song on here that has screaming in more abundance. And honestly, it did sort of make me miss the screaming, but that once again also shows that Bad Omens was wanting to make this song stand out as the only song that had something like that in that amount, which makes the album feel like it has more of a purpose and more like they're not just screaming just scream because that's what people want. And like I said, this album is more poppy than their previous releases, and I think that makes for some really intriguing songs on here that show that they could do pop very well if they decided to embrace that direction entirely. Bad Decisions is a great example of this. A song that I started out hesitant on, but has become one of my favorites with how incredibly catchy it is. It sounds like if Maroon 5 was actually a good band trying and was incorporating some actual instrumentation and atmosphere. I really love what this song does, and it's one that is very fun. And then you have IDWTS, which is an acronym for I Don't Want the Money, which brings an intriguing old style of electronic hardcore that I haven't heard too often these days, so it was sort of cool to hear that style. They lean more on the pop side for sure, but it's something that I was not necessarily expecting this band to tackle, and it works very well for them. Now, this album isn't entirely perfect. There are definitely some points where I feel like it falters, and I do think the first half of this album is a little stronger than the second half. Songs like Who Are You and Somebody Else just really don't do much for me, and I feel like as a whole the album is a little disorganized in places. I do think each song here has a purpose in telling the story of this ill-fated relationship, but the order of certain songs is a little confusing to me. Like, for example, putting What Do You Want From Me before Artificial Suicide was a little bit of an odd choice to me, but at the same time, the album does work and is very strong. And right now, I'd say it's so strong that it is in contention for my favorite albums of the year. It is so good, and I think it shows that Bad Omens have finally made an identity for themselves. This album deserves the hype and deserves the recognition, in my opinion, and you definitely need to check it out. I'm going to give this one a very strong 4 out of 5 stars.
18 said I'ma be anything, but just like my old man, selling houses to all those families while his family sat at home.
Next up is an album that I honestly do not know why I checked this out, but I did. I guess I was mildly intrigued by it after really disliking the lead single Fancy Stuff from Walker Hayes, but it is his album Country Stuff. And honestly, I don't really have much to say about this album besides the fact that it is really bad. As someone who has been trying to get into country more, An album like this, I could see being a deterrent for anyone trying to, honestly. If this is the stuff that is mainstream, I can understand why some people are cynical of the country ever being as good as it used to be. Because this album just brings out every cliche of modern country that people do not like. It tries to be boyfriend country and it tries to be bro country, and Walker Hayes brings out the absolute cliches of both genres to the forefront. It makes for an album that, in my opinion, is just incredibly boring and uninteresting. And Walker himself as a vocalist, I am sorry to say, just is not that interesting. In fact, in some places, he just doesn't sound that good. I just don't think he's that personable of a vocalist, and I think the lyrics here really speak for themselves and how poorly written they are. I just honestly did not care for this album, and at the end of the day, I do not care for it. It's very disorganized and feels like a collection of boring songs that are going to be meant to populate the radio just as that as filler songs and nothing else. It's one of my least favorite albums of the year, and sadly, there's just not much else to say about it. 1.5 out of 5 stars for me. Obviously, don't recommend this one. There's a couple of okay songs like Briefcase, but other than that, this album is pretty bad.
Your love for more of the night. I try to put up a fight. Can't tie me down.
And finally, this is an album that I've been meaning to talk about forever, but finally I'm getting to talk about here, and that is Dawn FM by The Weeknd, the sequel to After Hours. And I think it is intentionally meant as a sequel. If After Hours was The Weeknd's character sort of dying at the end of that album, then Dawn FM is him sort of going through purgatory, which makes me think that there is going to be one more album in this trilogy, and The Weeknd has already hinted to that. And the fact that Dawn FM is almost as good as After Hours makes me very excited for that third album, because yeah, this is an excellent release. It's pretty great through and through. Now, I would say that After Hours is a pretty dour and dark album, feeling like you're strolling through the seedy clubs of Las Vegas at night. But Dawn FM, while there are some songs that have that vibe, it feels a lot more optimistic, like you're at this very fun dance party in a nightclub that is just meant to be a fun time, nothing more, nothing less. And I think that's what this album is as well. The Weeknd was definitely doing a commentary on his own persona and After Hours and his issues with drug addiction and relationships. And now in Dawn FM, it seems like he's holding himself accountable for those things and even trying to sort of forgive himself for those things and try to be a better person. And I think that communication comes through very well. And what's more, the hooks are there to justify this album through and through. Gasoline was a very unexpected song for The Weeknd, where his voice sounds very different, and I really loved it. And you've still got songs that are pretty much classic Weeknd, things that you've come to expect from him, like Out of Time, which is just an absolutely gorgeous song from front to back, or Take My Breath, which is an immediately catchy song that is definitely my favorite on the album and will almost certainly be one of my favorite hit songs of the year, and it's just excellent. That also goes for Sacrifice, which has this excellent bass riff that is so much fun to listen to, such an absolute delight. And then you've got the closer, Less Than Zero, which is one of the most grounded songs The Weeknd has done. It strips away a lot of the polish and goes for this very simple synth riff with The Weeknd's very beautiful voice layered on top of it, and I think it works pretty well for that reason. And this album flows very well from front to back in general, with some transitions that are absolutely mind-boggling. The extended version of Take My Breath in particular is a really cool one that really swept me off my feet. Now, this album isn't perfect by any means, and I do think it's not necessarily as strong as After Hours, and there are a couple of songs that just don't hit me as much as I would want them to, but at the same time, I do find myself enjoying this album quite a bit every time I come back to it. So I'm going to be giving this one a strong 3.5 out of 5 stars. So yeah, that ends this episode of The Critical Corner. What were your thoughts on any of the albums I talked about? Let me know in the comments down below. And yeah, once again, the content should be back in stronger force for the near future. I will try to have at least one video weekly like this, and my next episode of The Critical Corner will definitely be movie focused once again, and I am excited to talk about several different movies. But until then, I will see you all in the next video.